just like to introduce the next speaker is Jack Cunningham from Bishop Grosse Test, University of Lincoln, who has written, and this is according both to Google and as I understand it, written two books, one on Archbishop Usher, the mid-17th century Archbishop who proved that the world was created on the 23rd of October, 4004.
4:30 in the afternoon.
I thought it was a Saturday evening.
I think it was, yeah.
and another book on Grosse Test, and as I said, I am reliably informed. I believe that they're not the same book. I apologise for trying to improve.
I tried to get away with that.
Earlier on. And he's going to talk about Robert Grosse Test and the Oxford years in a few seconds. A minute.
Yeah, I'm just going to try and get this on top. Oh, that's wonderful, wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. Do tell me, just even raise a hand if I'm not coming across, if you're having trouble hearing me. Also, do put your hand up if I talk too quickly. I'm from Donegal in Ireland, and we do have a habit of getting excited about subjects and talking too quickly. And do wave and tell me to slow it down if that happens, and it inevitably will happen. Robert Grosstest. We first come across Robert Grosstest in the late 12th century. We are told that he is born in Stow in Suffolk, and at an early age his mother packs him off to Lincoln to go and study. And as he wanders off into the world, her wonderful advice is ringing in his ears. She tells him, Robert, she says, always value the food of the mind over the food of the belly. And we are told that he arrives in Lincoln then, and he wants to study there, but he's a poor scholar, and how can he study? And he knocks on the richest house he sees, that happens to be the mayor of Lincoln. And the mayor of Lincoln comes out with a cape on, and he takes one look at this boy, and he says to him, I will give you this cape on now to eat as long as you make me a promise. You will never become the Bishop of Lincoln. And Robert Grosstest, remembering the wonderful advice of his mother, refuses and wanders away. And the mayor is so impressed with him that he says, come back. I will fund your education in the cathedral school. And the rest is history, as they say. Well, it's a lovely, wonderful kind of Dick Whittington story, isn't it? But it does point to kind of a problem with Robert Grosstest, and that is that if he did not become a bishop by the age of 67, we wouldn't know a tremendous amount about his life. His life is full of that kind of legendary stuff before that, and it has led to a certain amount of controversy, which I will illustrate now. There's a nice picture of Lincoln Cathedral where he was attached for a great deal of his life in a rather stormy relationship. And there is Oxford in the 13th century, where he undoubtedly ends up. But there are two rival theories about him. One coming from Daniel Callas, a Dominican who wrote in the 1950s. And he places Robert Grosstest very importantly in Hereford. The first time we kind of get to hear about Robert Grosstest is a letter from Gerald of Wales recommending him to William de Vere, the Bishop of Hereford, and he goes there as a student and a clerk. And it's a good place for him to be, because at this time in history it is a very scientific place. It is a hub of scientific endeavour. So there is in Hereford. Now, William de Vere unfortunately dies in 1199. And we don't hear about Grosstest, but we are almost certain that he leaves Hereford at that stage, and Daniel Callas says he comes to Oxford, where he is a master of the arts. He will have undoubtedly have left Oxford in 1209 in what James mentioned, which was the suspendium clericorum, when a student kills his girlfriend or a woman that may not have been his girlfriend, and he is hung by a kind of a posse led by the Oxford sheriff. Now, this is against the law. You cannot punish an Oxford student because they are clerics and they are subject to canon law. So there was a great uproar about this. There's a huge infringement on clerical rights, and the masters and students of Oxford leave, and Daniel Callis argues here, and I would agree with him, that Grosstest ends up in Paris at this stage. Then we get a papal legate granting Oxford its charter in 1214, peace is restored, and the masters and students return. And this is when Daniel Callis has Grosstest returning to Oxford and indeed becoming its first chancellor. We know that he is we almost certainly know that he's the first Chancellor of Oxford because the Bishop of Lincoln says you can't call yourself a Chancellor. I didn't appoint you. Now, you can act as a Chancellor, but I did not appoint you, and you cannot call yourself a Chancellor. And that's a nice kind of insider information about what was going on there. It's a very political time, and the guilds are asserting their authority, and they quite clearly said at Oxford, we're going to vote for our own Chancellor, we're going to elect our own Chancellor. And this is in the Diocese of Lincoln, and so it's really infringing on the bishop's territory. So he's first Chancellor of Oxford, and then in 1229 he gives it all up to become the first teacher, the first lector of the Franciscans who have just arrived in England, and he becomes their teacher here at Oxford, and he does that until 1235, when probably at the age of 67 he is elected Bishop of Lincoln. There is another theory, there is another take on this, and that's from Richard Southern, who describes Grosstest as an English mind. He is not in Paris, he is not in Oxford till quite late, he is in Hereford, and that's why he's so good, that's why he's so original, because he's not in the stifling atmosphere of scholastic Europe. He is in England, and this gives him an independent mind, a scientific mind, an inquiring mind that isn't like the scholastics who have got their set texts in front of them and are saying, I will refer to these only. Grosstest is freed from all of this, and he is an English and an independent mind. He can't go to Paris, he's too poor. And he becomes the first Chancellor of Oxford quite late in 1225, and he's then becomes bishop in 1235. So those are the contesting theories about his life, and that's one of the only times we really know officially about his attachment to Oxford. In 1224 we know in 1224 we know the Franciscans arrive, and then he becomes the lector after that. We also know that in 1234 there is a royal mandate to arrest all the prostitutes in Oxford, and it is given to Robert Grosstest and Robert Bacon, the leader of the Dominicans in Oxford, and possibly the uncle of Roger Bacon. And he that officially places Grosstest in this city. And I couldn't resist that picture. I do like this is a medieval prostitute, and she's walking past and obviously plying her wares, and there's somebody beckoning her in who looks suspiciously like a cleric to me. I'm not sure if it was Robert Grosstest, but I'd like to think it was somehow. Okay, and controversy now reigns as well, not just about his life and where he was and what he did, but also about how big an impact is Robert Grosstest. Where do we place him intellectually? Was he enormous, or was he quite important? Where do we place him on that range of things? And controversy about his intellect actually existed even when he was alive. It was told that this man knew so much that this must be magical. And in fact, and this picture cuts it off frustratingly, but in fact the rumour starts going around that he has in his rooms a brazen head, a large brass head, and he can ask questions to this brass head, and the answers are spewed out, and this is clearly how he knows so much. And I think Roger Bacon was also said to have had one of these heads. Incidentally, the contemporary sources tell us, the 16th century source tells us that Robert Grosstest gives up being a scientist and becomes a theologian because his brazen head breaks. Now, this is highly insulting to theologians like me, suggesting that you don't need a brazen head if you're a theologian. It's a kind of less taxing endeavour. And so, and another footnote to the Brazen Head story. I am told, I don't know, but I have read that the relics of the Brazen Head are in Lincoln College, Oxford. So if you're curious about this, knock on their door one day and demand to see the broken remains of the Brazen Head. And maybe we can reconstruct it. How useful would that be? Okay. Sorry, I want to go back, and now I'm going forward, and okay, previous. There we go. Bear with me a second, and previous again. Okay. Now let's have a look at his reputation. Then Roger Bacon says this of him: "For there have been some famous men, such as Robert, Bishop of Lincoln, and Brother Adam Marsh, and many others, who have known how by the power of mathematics to unfold the causes of all things and to give us a sufficient explanation of human and divine phenomena." Great praise indeed from a great man. Roger Bacon goes on to say more or less that Grosstest is the first to do it. The questioner was right before that people are applying mathematics, and one of the reasons before Robert Grosstest to scientific endeavour, and one of the reasons why Grosstest is doing this is because he's reading the Arabs who are doing it. Sir Richard Southern says that he is the greatest product of Oxford University, which also is great praise indeed. But the best and the most highest acclaim comes from Alistair Crombie, writing in the 1950s, who says more or less that Robert Grosstest invents experimental science. This is a man who invented the what we now call science, and in the second edition, he kind of waters down that claim, but he still, to the end, maintained that Grosstest is responsible for this. But we have a problem with that. And the problem is this: if that is true, Crombie says it's because he invents the method. He doesn't come up with great scientific discoveries, but he comes up with the method of science, and that's highly important. And if that's true, well, we have to explain the relatively moribund nature of science that comes after him up until the Renaissance. If Grosstest has discovered this method, well, how come we're not getting a great flurry of scientific achievements after that? And why did that happen? And the other, perhaps most important thing comes from a scholar called Bruce Eastwood, who points out that the word experimenta is important here. It isn't, as we would understand it, experiment. It is much more akin to how Aristotle was using it, which is experience. And when Grosstest is saying experiment is important, he is in actual fact saying our experience is important. So he's not setting up controlled experiments, he's using his experiences. And just to make that absolutely clear, we get a commentary from him when he becomes a theologian on the celestial hierarchy. And he says in that, the angels have no experimental science of sin. And that, for me, that's a very good indication of just how he is using this word. Okay, so perhaps Crombie is over-egging the pudding there, but I hope during this talk to prove that that there is something in Grosstest which is highly important nevertheless. This is Paris. I'm only throwing that in there because this adds to the controversy. Scholars like me, historians like me, are claiming that he's in Paris at this time, and I try and trace his thinking and his perspective to the school of Chartres, and other people are saying he never set foot in Paris. I think he's reading Aristotle there, and I'd maybe like your opinion in a break sometime about this, but a theologian, a historian in Cardiff says to me he couldn't have been reading Aristotle in Paris at the beginning of the 13th century, and I know why. It's because in Paris we have law after law after law that forbids the reading of Aristotle, so he couldn't be reading it. Now, I don't know about you, but if in 1,000 years' time somebody says that nobody was smoking cannabis at university because there's laws and laws and laws proving that they weren't doing it. In fact, if you have a book, particularly on your reading list if you're an academic, and you want students to read it, ban it. Tell them they can't read it. It's only my opinion. Okay, important for Robert Grosstest is Aristotle. As particularly important is the posterior analytics which he comments on, and he comments on it in a quite substantial way. When he comments on the physics of Aristotle, it's kind of musings, but here he really tackles this great book, and this is important for a number of reasons. In the posterior analytics, Aristotle says everything that is known through demonstration. This is one of the reasons why, even though this has been translated in 1140 in Venice, it is not being consulted that much in Latin Europe because well, for one thing, it's difficult. It's a difficult book, but more fundamental than that, it is saying that we need to ask questions. Now there is, and I don't want to kind of create a horrible generalization here, but that if you are starting to say that we can acquire new knowledge, it is going against a fundamental thought within the church that actually we have a golden years of the accumulation of knowledge, which lasted for 800 years, 400 years before BC and roughly 400 years after. And the great scholars have given us this compendium of knowledge now, and that all we have to do is consult this knowledge. And this goes against that. All you have to do if you're a scholar is draw the new knowledge out of the old knowledge. That's what you kind of do. Now, I know that's a gross caricature of scholasticism, but it's there is an aspect of that which is there. It is also theologically difficult because of this. Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden, the beginning of history, and everything was perfect in that garden until it all went pear-shaped or apple-shaped or whatever shape it was. And they ate of the tree of knowledge, and there were consequences of that. Now, Genesis tells us quite clearly that these consequences are this, that Adam from now on is not going to be able to get away with not working for a living. He can't, when he wants shelter, just rest amongst the trees, and when he wants to eat berries off the bushes. He can't do that anymore. He's going to have to work by the sweat of his brow, and the land is going to kind of dry up, and he's going to have to work this. And Eve is going to suffer during childbirth, and they are cast out of the Garden of Eden. And there is a kind of an implication that death comes into the world. It's not explicitly biblical, but death comes into the world because of this fall. Now, that's all kind of what Genesis says about it. But since Genesis, right up into the medieval period, there is another understanding. There's an additional understanding of the implications of the fall. And the implications of the fall, by the time we get to Grosstest, are this, that with the fall, it wasn't just a bodily kind of disablement that happened, it was intellectual. Before the fall, man knew everything about the universe and sufficient about God for his needs. And after the fall, that is somehow handicapped. And this is a problem then when it comes to our senses, because you cannot trust your senses. You cannot trust them since the fall because they have been skewed, they have been debased by sin. And therefore, if Aristotle is telling us that actually you can learn via your senses, then you, as a Christian, are going to have a bit of a problem in the Middle Ages with this idea. Okay, so in terms of the Arabs, just let me add here that they're important. They're important because they give the West, the Greeks, and they give the West Aristotle, and they are also showing the West, the Western world, how to think with a mathematical dimension to the mind. Okay, this is important when we come to Grosstest and Aristotle, because it wasn't just Thomas Aquinas who made Aristotle palatable for Western consumption. It is also, I believe, Grosstest. Sense perception is true. Grosstest is saying you can acquire new knowledge through your sense perception. But importantly, it is via gratia sensus. It is via the senses and not kind of thanks to the senses. We're not getting all knowledge comes from the divine intellect via the senses. Aristotle comes up with a very, very important allegory that Grosstest leaps on, and he's the only one to do this in the Western world. He's the first person to tackle the posterior analytics, and he's the first person to leap on this allegory as useful for Christianity. Aristotle says that your senses are like this. They're like a retreating army, and the army is lost all its formation, and there's no orders being adhered to, and there is general chaos as it runs away in the battle. And then one soldier turns, and as that one soldier turns, another soldier next to them turns, until this is passed on, until the command turns. The intelligence of the army turns, and all is turned now, and all can function. That's our process of the mind, and it comes via the senses. And Grosstest leaps on us. That is entirely compatible with the story of Genesis. That's the description of the fall. Aristotle didn't know this. Aristotle doesn't know that mankind's senses are marred by the fall, and that's because he's a pagan. This is true. This is how we can use Aristotle now. He has described to us in pagan language what we can do. And it is difficult to underestimate what Grosstest does with this. He really takes this and runs with it in an extraordinary way until he gets to the stage where he says that we are capable of restoring all knowledge. And he talks eventually of a theosis. And the theosis is when we become as God. It's a deification. And this is an extraordinary leap forward in terms of the history of thought. Grosstest's method is also important because he uses mathematical unity. The universe is a mathematical place. I will get to it later on, but I want to talk about his description of creation. It's an important description, but what is the most important thing that comes out of it is that the God that comes out of Grosstest's theory of creation is an architect, is a geometrical architect. He constructs this universe on geometrical terms. Now, if you believe that, and once you believe that, then you can start unraveling the mysteries of the universe, because it hasn't been made randomly. It hasn't been made by warring or feckless gods like the Greeks had in mind. It has been made by a God who is a scientist and a mathematician and a geometer. And he set the universe out like this, and it's ordered. It is an ordered universe. And with that in mind, we can start to unravel it. And this is highly important for me. Okay, so how did he do it? Well, his induction process goes like this. He starts off with all phenomena are not complex. They're all made up of composite principles. And these principles are applicable because of mathematical unity. They're universal principles. So if we work out how a prism works in a certain way, we can apply that elsewhere. So we break things down to their composites, and then we understand them. And then from that, we can put the composites back together again in order to understand other things related to the original. I'll show you how that works a bit later on, because that probably didn't make all that much sense. Okay, so let's have a look at this. There is a uniformity in nature. The same course, provided it remains in the same condition, cannot produce anything but the same effect. He is also a big favour of the principle of parsimony. Nature operates in the shortest way possible. Now this, I think, is where he makes his most significant contribution, and it is with light. He thinks that light is the fundamental, the essential element in the whole universe. It is the primary physical substance, and it informs everything from this table to the glasses to the people sitting in front of us. It runs through everything. Now, that's highly important scientifically, because if you are a scientist in the 13th century, the science of optics, which is mathematical, can open up, can give you a glimpse, a privileged glimpse into the workings of the universe. And practically speaking, it's reasonably cheap to set up experiments in optics. And it's easy to do. And if Grosstest is doing it, then this is the first time he's saying, look, if I'm using this prism to understand things, it's giving me a glimpse in just how mathematical this universe is constructed. And that is an important development. And I know that when we get to the 17th century and we have a scientific revolution, optics isn't really at the forefront, but that the idea that's running behind it, I think, it is definitely there. Okay, so let's have a look at how this works. On the rainbow. Aristotle has said that the rainbow is reflected light in the raindrops that are inside the cloud. That's how the rainbow works. But Robert Grosstest has read the Arabs. He's read in particular Al-Kindi on burning glass, and he understands spectrum. So he breaks it all up. This is a complex, this is not a complex phenomenon. It is a phenomenon made up of very, very simple processes. So he's going to break it up now. And he looks at different spectra. He looks, first of all, at spectra that is created by circles. So he looks at the steam that comes out of a watermill. He looks at, the rainbow that comes out of a watermill. He looks at the rainbow that comes out of oars turning in water. He looks at the rainbow created when he squirts water out of his mouth. And he notices that all of these things have something in common. They produce a prism, a spectrum, but it is curved. It is sometimes circle, but it is at least part of a circle. And so we know that about them. But there's a different kind of spectra. When we pass it through a prism, it produces something that isn't circular, and he passes it through a hexagonal shape as well, and he notices it breaks up the light. We get a spectra, but it isn't circular. So now he knows that we've got two types of spectrum. And then he goes on to a third rainbow that he sees, and this is reflected in the wings of a bird. We see a rainbow. I didn't know that this was true, but my ornithologist friend says if you look at the tail of a magpie, you get rainbows. Don't know. Perhaps he went to one of those universities where they smoked a lot of cannabis. But there they are. Grosstest sees them. He sees them in these, and he says that but here's the difference. Unlike the first two species, this is not created by refraction. This is created by reflection. But they all do the same thing. They all create colours. They create this spectrum because when white light hits them, it weakens the white light, and it weakens it to different degrees of intensity depending on the angle at which it hits it, and this produces a rainbow in different ways. So he's broken it all down now, and now he can reconstruct it, and he can say that this rainbow in the sky belongs to the first of our categories. It's round, and therefore we can say, and he says for the first time that the rainbow is created by refraction, but it is because the cloud is a huge lens. It acts like a huge spherical lens, and it casts the rainbow onto another cloud that acts like a huge screen. Now, this isn't true, of course, but there are things in it that are true. And what he's doing there is taking the rainbow down from the clouds and into your living space where you can experiment with this and look at it, and even if that experiment is just about experience, it's taking it down from the clouds and bringing it in front of us where we can examine it properly. And this, I think, is the start of a process which is truly scientific. And when we get to the next century, when we get to Vitello and Theodoric of Freiburg, these people are working out just how the rainbow does work through refraction, and they're doing it, I think, thanks to Grosstest, who's saying, let's look at this scientifically. Okay. This is probably his most important tract. It's a couple of pages long, but it is the tract on light. And this is him at his most imaginative, most beautiful, in fact. And he describes creation, and he describes it in purely rational terms without overt reference to either patristics or to the Bible. Having said that, it is informed by the Genesis account all the way through. He never makes a reference to Genesis, but the account is there. And he says this, that the fiat of God is, let there be light. Very first thing God says. Now, Grosstest has noticed something. In his room at night when he switches on the light, when he lights a lamp, jumping the kind of bit there. When he lights a lamp, it instantly fills his room from that one single spot there, instantly at the speed of infinity, fills his entire room. Now he makes a conclusion from experience, from experimenta. He's seen that, he knows that happens, and now he can apply it to the bigger picture. And he says at the beginning of time, there is matter exists. God creates a single point on the universe in which matter exists, except it doesn't exist in any dimension. It's not two-dimensional, one-dimensional, three-dimensional, and it doesn't exist in the dimension of time. But as light hits it, this light from the divinity gives it corporeity, it gives it body, it's a form, and it produces. Matter can't exist without a form, as Aristotle tells us, and that happens instantly. Light hits matter, and it becomes part of time, and it becomes part of history. But remember back to the cell when we light that lamp, light spreads out at the speed of infinity, and this is exactly what's going to happen now. Light spreads out at the speed of infinity all over the universe, and it can't now leave matter behind because it's the form of matter, and so it drags matter with it all over the universe. And this is the first day of creation. He also says something very, very important, I think, as well. He says that this matter is a simple being, and it cannot be created into a quantum without the application of infinity. And infinity can only be understood by an infinite mind. But this infinity has to be there, because if you multiply a simple substance by a finite number, it will not create a quantum. It has to be multiplied by an infinite number, and then it creates this universe, but not an infinite universe, because a simple being is not an infinite. And you only get an infinite if an infinite is multiplied with an infinite. If an infinite is multiplied with a finite, you get a finite universe. And this, is very critical of Aristotle. This is where Aristotle gets it wrong. Aristotle thinks that the universe is infinite. It has, according to Grosstest, a time and a beginning and an end and a parameter, which he calls the firmament. And this, I think, is not only a very, very beautiful piece of scientific writing, but it's a very important one as well. Okay, did Grosstest invent science then? No, he didn't. He didn't create modern experimental science. But he did some important things. He wasn't the first person to say we should apply maths to this, but he really asserted that. And he wrote a tract on lines, figures, and angles. And in that, he explicitly, and he almost urges us to see the universe in terms of mathematics. When he talks about mathematics, incidentally, he's talking about geometry, not arithmetic. And everything in our universe is informed by this. God is a mathematician. And when we do that, we do something, I think, which is very important for the history of science. And we can look at what came after him up until the Renaissance and say, well, if he was so great, why didn't he inspire that? Well, he inspired an Oxford school, an important Franciscan Oxford school. And the Franciscans, I might say, are important in this whole history, because they are not Dominicans. That's an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? Kind of obvious. I'm going to apologise for this appalling generalisation, but the Dominicans are Aristotelians, and they tend to say that we need to look at Aristotle and just Aristotle. The Franciscans tend to be more romantic in their theology than that. They tend to be more kind of, less mundane and more kind of spiritual. And Grosstest talks about something, and this is one of the other reasons why he makes Aristotle palatable for the Western world. He talks about that knowledge you get through the senses, and he says it's very important, but it is not as important as another type of knowledge. And this is independent of the senses, and it really does exist, and it's called solerta. And this is that moment where you say, yes, I've got it. I've really got it. And it is independent of an experiment. It is independent of something that you are doing to achieve this. It is something that just comes to you. It is a divine illumination. And he says that happens sometimes. And that is supreme to the knowledge that we require through science. It's sapienta, it's wisdom, and it is superior to scientia, which is the knowledge that we acquire through these things. And that's important. That's important because that makes the West be able to say, good, you've subsumed this scientific knowledge to the knowledge that's owned by the church. And now you can get on with it. And I think that that's an important thing to do. And incidentally, I think it really kind of marries with what Descartes was doing in the 17th century when he talked about that dichotomy of mind and matter. And I think he's trying to reassure the church that what Galileo's doing doesn't concern you. It's about matter. And you have the supreme realm of the mind to care about. Let us unworthy scientists get on with the mundane while you deal with the celestial. And I think that's, it might not be a laudable thing to say, but it's entirely practical and very, very useful. So where do we conclude on all of this? What do we think about Grosstest's place in history? A very interesting thing happened to me as I was driving along in my car, listening to Stephen Hawking give his Reith lecture a couple of weeks ago, and then a question came at the end, and I think it was a child said to him, Professor Hawking, where would you go if you had a TARDIS? Well, you could go anywhere in the universe, anywhere in time. Where would you go? And Stephen Hawking says, I would set the dial to Italy in the 17th century. I want to talk to Galileo, because Galileo for me was the first person to say you can be critical of Aristotle. He's the first person to say that you can acquire new knowledge through your senses and through reason. And for me, that's the beginning of modern science. Well, I'm not claiming that Grosstest was the first scientist, but if that's Professor Hawking's definition of a scientist, and who am I to disagree with the great professor, I strongly advise him, if he wants to meet the first person to do that, he needs to turn the dial of the TARDIS 300 years previous to the century that he was aiming for in Italy. Thank you very much for listening to me. Say before the questions, I'm not a scientist. GCSE science is as far as I got, so go easy on me, you guys out there.
Thanks for that. Who would like to answer the first question?
Hi. You put up these two different possible biographies, and the one on the left looked like a fairly conventional biography of someone who was going to be chancellor at that time. But then on the right, Southern is claiming that he never went to Paris. He spent all of his time in Hereford. Does he have an explanation of how he then suddenly is elevated to be the chancellor of Oxford University without having any of the sort of conventional, academic progress you would expect to see for that kind of an office?
I just don't know that he does. I really don't. I think what he does is what we all do when it comes to Grosstest, pre-Bishop Grosstest, and he says, look, we don't know, but we can make implications of this. This evidence is missing. Well, he seems to me to be saying, we've just got to accept that this man's mind was so brilliant, and the stuff that he's coming up with is so good that they're saying he's got a brazen head, and they're making him Chancellor of Oxford University. I'm not convinced by that. I'm the historian who believes he's in Paris. I think he's an art student in Paris. I think he's on the left bank of the Seine, outside of the theology faculty, where they are really. This is the original Latin Quarter, where they're outside the kind of the observation of the Ile de City, and they're outside the observation of Notre Dame Cathedral and the Chancellor there, and they are being very imaginative. They're reading forbidden texts. And I think Grosstest's there with them, and it's again like Richard Southern. I've got to say, I don't know, but the most you can say about this life is that it's not entirely improbable. And Richard Southern does what I do and what everybody else does, which says this is what I read in it all. But I think I've got a note of scepticism in your voice, and I share that scepticism. I don't know how someone could tip up here and become Chancellor without that kind of training and background.
Yeah, so it'd be hard to understand. I mean, look at the both, certainly the larger physics com and then the sumuli. I mean, there is nothing to distinguish these in terms of algorithmic procedure from, physics com time. And if he has this alternative trajectory, how are you going to explain that? To add, how are the people defending Southern School? I don't get it. I agree.
Yeah. Somebody suggested to me once, and perhaps unkindly, that Richard Southern's biography of Grosstest is a little bit of an autobiography, and what he describes happening to Grosstest is what happened to him, and that's a bit unkind, but maybe it's true as well. There's no relatives here, are there?
Hi, well, as a Lincolnshire lad, I'm very proud of Lincolnshire traditions, particularly Boole, who invented modern logic.
Highly inspired by Grosstest.
And Newton invented modern dynamics, they say. And Bob Templeton, who wrote the thriller out for Michael Jackson. But I'm poured over Grosse Test. I mean, you're claiming, it seems to be on the one hand, it made many important contributions, in many respects, and also in scientific method somehow, yet you made not a single scientific discovery. You oppose his scientific mind to the scholastics' non-scientific mind, I presume. The scholastics made quite a lot of important discoveries, especially impetus dynamics, and predicting there was no terminal speed of free-fall motion. So I'm bereft of, I'm happy that I can't find anything in Grosse Test that's an important scientific discovery. It seems to me if you invented a method which doesn't get any scientific results, it's not a very good advert for it. The only hope you gave me was in this day Iride, that in the rainbow stuff. But are you going to depress me yet again and say there's no actual discovery there?
Yeah, refraction. The rainbow is caused by refraction. I believe that Robert Grosstest is the first person to say that.
Okay, that's good. Okay, and does it tell us something new about it?
That it's caused by refraction.
Okay, thank you, I'm living down.
Anyone else? Okay, I would want to front.
Do we know anything about Brother Adam Marsh?
Yeah, he's buried alongside Robert Grosstest. He is a Franciscan. He wrote a lot of things that I'm almost certain to think now that the only thing we have left of Adam Marsh is letters. Somebody in the room who knows more about him might contradict that, but I'm 90% certain that that's the case, that we only have his letters. And the only thing, the legacy that we have of Adam Marsh is people like Roger Bacon saying he's a great mind, a great teacher.
We don't know why Roger Bacon thought he was so great.
Except the mathematical thing. He thinks, rightly or wrongly, that Grosstest and Adam Marsh are the first people who are doing maths proper scientifically.
Can I just ask if you can lay out what Grosstest's attitude is towards Islam, in terms of the general Ben Ardashar notion that Christians are standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, does Grosstest articulate an explicit account of how he thinks Christians have gone beyond what they're standing on the shoulders of? Are they dwarves? Standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, how does he use Islamic commentaries in translation?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. It's difficult for me because I haven't read a tract that is called The Conversation Between a Christian and a Muslim, and that does exist, and I've got to be honest and tell you that I haven't read that. I do know, practically speaking, that when the great collections for taxes come round to the Diocese of Lincoln for the Crusades, Robert Grosstest is not only gathering them, but he's persuading others that this is something we really ought to do. And I don't know beyond that really what his attitude is to Muslims. He's not only using, I might say, that Muslim texts. There's a very, very important Jewish scholar from Spain called Ibn Gibrial, who is very important to him. So I think he is one of the people, and I think this is happening in Paris, who are saying there is no frontier to knowledge. The Western Latin world may have said there was, and may have ring-fenced this body of knowledge, but actually we go beyond that. If you do that, though, and this is just my speculation, if you do that, I think you've got to know that you're going into terra incognita, and you're also going into terra that is dangerous. And you can't apologise too much for it. You can go and use it, but don't come back and tell us that this is wonderful stuff and they're wonderful people. You know, I think you've got to be very careful about this. But there might be other people in the room who know more about Christian attitudes to Islam than me.
I'm sure it'll come up later.
Yeah. That's my guess. That you by all means use this stuff, but be very, very careful and don't be careful what claims you're making for these people, because you've got to persuade a lot of hostile people that they should be doing this as well, and you've got to be subtle about that, I think.
Okay, thanks very much for a great talk. Thanks.